Our guest today is Ana-Maria Tomlinson. Thanks again for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much, Alex, for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk about the National Code for Transit and Passenger Rail Systems in Canada, which is a very interesting idea and something that could be adapted, obviously, here in the States. Just to start, can you talk a little bit about the plan and how it might strengthen safety, consistency, interoperability, and that sort of thing across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. And great starting question. Before I dive into the nitty-gritty of our vision for the code, I just want to take a quick step back to just set some context around, the landscape here in Canada.
Sure.
Our transit and passenger rail sector is really going through tremendous growth. We're
Mhm.
seeing an expansion of over 40% in terms of kilometers built and stations under construction, right? We have over 130 kilometers currently under construction, 148 stations. This is a huge kind of unprecedented expansion of our existing, subway lines, LRT lines, regional passenger rail, and even high-speed rail. So with that, there's been a lot of focus on transit and passenger rail in Canada. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that in some cases, these projects, because they are so complex, such, huge undertakings,
Mhm.
um, they are experiencing challenges, both in terms of, project delays, cost overruns, and this experience is contributing to an erosion of public trust.
Mhm.
And so that's really a challenge that the sector as a whole is looking to overcome. Now, some of the key issues that are currently encountered span from, challenges at the design stage, construction stage, even commissioning and implementation stage. So what we're seeing is, a breadth of safety as well as quality issues. And so that's what brought us to this point of, thinking about a coordinated standards framework to really support that design and construction phase for all kinds of transit and passenger rail infrastructure projects in Canada. At the moment, Canada does not have dedicated standards and codes to govern these processes. So organizations in Canada are leveraging other national standards, international standards, in
Mhm.
this sort of blend, if you will, of standards that were never designed or developed for the Canadian landscape, and also standards that weren't necessarily developed for transit. And so, as you can see, that can quickly contribute to a number of, challenges in terms of standards interpretation as well as implementation.
Right.
So what we're looking to do is provide some much needed clarity and consistency in terms of what are the requirements that must be met for safety as well as performance for transit and passenger rail in Canada. And we hope that um, that clarity and let's say predictability that can come with having standards in place can address some of the challenges that we're seeing come up across some of these major infrastructure projects in Canada.
Um, so the plan to release this code is this just kind of a template for what you would like to see? I mean, do you have some governmental support and that sort of thing to kind of implement these changes that the code's looking at?
So to initiate and to help us kind of get organized as part of our planning stages, we've taken a few different steps. We've initiated research around transit and passenger rail projects to dive down into the challenges that are being encountered across these projects in Canada and understand where is there a need for more consistent standards to clarify some of the requirements that must be met. And we also have established a standard strategy working group. And this group is composed of subject matter experts from across the country representing, transit agencies, government bodies, engineering consultancies that are actively working in the field. And we've tasked them with the monumental task of developing a framework. You know, this is because it's such an enormous undertaking and we're really starting from zero, we want to be organized in terms of what structure the code will take, what elements will be addressed within the code, how each of these subjects will be, coordinated so that, the code is able to be applied seamlessly. And so this working group has been meeting regularly, working through, if you will, let's say an expanded table of contents and a structure for the transit and passenger rail code that we envision. And so that work is currently underway. We estimate that they'll complete their task in the next 3 to 4 months, and that will position us well to be able to initiate development on the code in April 2026.
Gotcha. And I'm curious if we can backtrack back to to where you
Yeah.
started. We had a previous guest recently talk about some of the issues with permitting and that sort of thing here in California specifically. Um, I'm wondering, some of the issues that Canada has faced. I mean, is it due to not really being set up for the expectation for rapid growth in public transit? Is there just some things that were unforeseeable as far as needing to address those before moving on with these large scale projects?
I mean, from a standards development perspective, which is our focus at the Canadian Standards Association, what we have identified as a challenge is that Canada lacks dedicated standards and codes to govern the completion of these projects, whereas other countries around the world have hundreds of
Okay.
standards to support the design and construction phase for these projects. And you know, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, these projects are very complex,
Hmm.
very complicated engineering projects. A lot of decisions are involved in managing and planning for the completion of such large undertakings.
Gotcha. And can you talk a little bit about more about that process? How are you looking at other countries and looking at ways to kind of implement that into Canada's infrastructure and its uniqueness in itself?
Great question, because we've heard quite a bit from the subject matter experts that we're speaking with that projects in Canada are currently leveraging a large number of other national or international standards, whether that's ARIMA standards, European standards, depending on what the project might require. And they wouldn't want to see us reinventing the wheel.
Hmm.
And certainly, we also don't want to reinvent the wheel. It takes a really long time to develop a high quality engineering standard. And so our first protocol is to, take a look around, understand what standards are currently being applied in Canada and are they appropriate for application, in Canada? Are there specific guidelines that need to accompany them to make sure that they're being applied in the right way or being interpreted in the right way? I mean, we have to keep in mind that these standards were never written for the Canadian context. So there's always some kind of translation that needs to be done to make sure that they are appropriate for use here. And then the second part of the challenge is when you're taking, a European standard and let's say, as an example, an American standard, and you want to use them together. Now, these two documents were never meant to be applied in that way.
Right.
And so you need to make sure that, they speak the same language, if you will, that they are able to be applied cohesively and will give you the results that you're looking for. And so that's something that we aim to address within the code is leveraging, so referencing international standards or other national standards
Hmm.
directly into the code, and then providing direction where needed to inform their correct application on Canadian projects.
Gotcha. And can you talk a little bit about some of the core areas the code is looking at? What specifically are you looking at implementing, and where is there kind of the most need for these set of standards?
Yeah, certainly. So because railway projects are so complex, we're looking at a long list of topics, including infrastructure, rolling stock, energy, noise and vibrations, safety and security, accessibility as well. So how do you ensure accessibility on your trains, but also within your stations? Operations and traffic management, as well as signaling and communications. So all of those topics are going to be included within the scope of the Transit and Passenger Rail Code. And then in addition to that, we have already kind of conceptualized how the code will be subdivided in such a way to address the different types of applications where you might need it. So for example, if you're building a subway extension, your requirements might look a certain way. So that will kind of look at that urban rail and light rail component as well. But your project might look at intercity passenger rail. So that will be a whole different section of the code dedicated to intercity passenger rail, and then a separate section that will tackle high-speed rail. So three separate sections, as well as a fourth, which is kind of a general requirements that will be applicable regardless of what your project looks like.
And obviously, can you talk about the obvious benefits of having these standards and how it can help when projects cross into different jurisdictions? Some of the can you talk a little bit about some of the immediate benefits and some of the, I guess, long-term benefits of having those standards in place, moving ahead as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're looking at national standards of Canada, which is what CSA Group develops, they are really intended to be applicable regardless of which jurisdiction you might be in, whether it's Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta, or any other province and territory in Canada. And so they'll be developed with regulations in mind. So one of the key tasks that the technical committee will have ahead of them is to develop requirements that can be met and that align with local requirements, regulatory requirements, whether it's provincial or federal.
Right.
So that's part of the process. We also will be establishing a technical committee that will be charged with the development of the code. And this technical committee will have representation from multiple interested parties, including regulators and government bodies. So regulators and representatives of Transport Canada or MTO or other government departments, they will all be sitting around the table and will have an opportunity to have their perspectives heard and have an opportunity to support that drafting process. So ultimately, by having that visibility, they can directly determine, hang on a second, this requirement doesn't quite jive with what we have in our regulations. Could we make this adjustment, right? So
Right.
that consensus-based, highly inclusive, highly collaborative process is designed to, help us get to a final document that will be, acceptable to all the interested parties, that will be able to be put into practice, regardless of where you are across the country, and that meets the needs of both regulators as well as industry, manufacturers, and engineering consultants. So that's the beauty, I guess, of the accredited standards development process.
Gotcha. And does this do these standards, do they kind of champion public-private partnerships, design build, those sorts of things? Or is it just establishing standards for projects if they choose to go down that path?
It's the latter. So we
Okay.
don't really dip our toes into the contracting side of things.
Mhm.
That's really not part of the standards development process, but really what we focus on is, yeah, those safety requirements, performance requirements that must be met and providing that clarity. And then regardless of what contract mode is used on a project, those standards and codes can be directly referenced within said contracts to make sure that those same requirements are are being worked towards.
Gotcha. And when you're writing standards like this, what's the group doing to um, establish these standards first, but then leave the flexibility to add things or to adjust on the fly as new things kind of come about?
Yes, I think that's part of the beauty of the standards development process is determining where you are able to set, very strict requirements around, certain topics or certain themes, whether it's the process that must be followed, or the, safety requirement that must be met, and where you can allow for different approaches to be used to reach the same objective.
Mhm.
And what we aim to do when we set standards is, we really give preference to performance-based requirements versus prescriptive requirements.
Right.
The difference between the two is that, when you're writing performance-based requirements, you're really describing what is that end stage that must be met, and you're allowing for flexibility in that approach, and that can make it easier to innovate. It can provide a little bit more, flexibility in those design choices that you might be making.
And as far as that flexibility going into infrastructure, accessibility, passenger safety, and that sort of thing, can you talk a little bit about that as well?
I mean, when we're looking at the requirements that must be set within the code, it's really we rely on the expertise and knowledge of our members. CSA doesn't hold the pen, but rather we bring together the very best minds that we can find across the country to make sure that the standard benefits from that broad knowledge and expertise. And so the committee will meet through a series of meetings and work through that consensus-based process to determine, what are the risk tolerances that are acceptable, and what safety requirements should be set within the standard and should be met by all projects moving forward.
Understood. In that context, how can stakeholders, transit agencies, suppliers kind of contribute to this process? Are you outreaching directly? Are you kind of open for them approaching you guys? And can you talk a little bit about that process?
Certainly. We're always happy to hear from experts who want to become involved in standards development. At the moment, we are actively working with our standard strategy working group, and that effort is well underway. However, when we are ready to establish our technical committee, which, as I mentioned, we're aiming for April 2026, at that time, we will conduct, a substantial amount of research and outreach to identify the subject matter experts that we need to inform the development of the code. And it will depend on, again, how the framework is conceptualized by our standard strategy working group, what the different sections within the code will be, and what areas of expertise do we need to have on our technical committee to make sure that everything can be addressed within the body of the code. So at that time, there will be ample opportunity for folks to get involved. We encourage experts to reach out to us, even now if they're interested, and we'll put their name on on our kind of running list of potential experts that we can have involved in the development of the code. If there is an interest from an organization to kind of monitor the development process, maybe have some visibility into the code development process, We will have a public review period, as with all standards,
Right.
a 60-day public review period where anyone will be able to access an online version of the code, view the content, and provide comments on individual clauses within the code. So they'll be able to, again, provide their feedback, provide their comments, and then the technical committee will have to take those comments on board and determine whether any changes must be made. So there are a couple of different ways, being involved directly,
Mhm.
in the writing process, or kind of reviewing the draft, a mature draft of the standard at a later date.
Gotcha. And ideally, when would you guys like to finish this process?
Great question. And we are quite ambitious with our timelines.
Okay.
For this project, we are setting ourselves up for a 4-year development process.
Okay.
It is a 4-part code. So each of these parts will be developed individually, but somewhat staggered. So we'll have the first one start, and that'll be an 18th to 20-month process. But maybe halfway through, we'll begin the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So kind of in that staggered fashion to get us to that, let's say, shortened timeline of 4 years. Now, having said that, we also recognize that it's really important to have that slight overlap in timing so that committees can determine, what we put in part 1 aligns with what we put in part 2, works
Right.
nicely with what we put in part 3 and part 4. So yeah, but overall, a 4-year timeline for the development, which is in line with our other major codes that we develop at CSA.
Okay. And then, best case scenario, that code is out in 4 years. What's the next steps from there? Is it kind of government implementation, or how does that process work once everything's completed?
So the standards and codes that CSA publishes, they're all voluntary
Gotcha.
upon publication, but they can become mandatory if they're referenced in policy or regulation or even contracts. So those are kind of the mechanisms that are available for making them mandatory for use. So there are a couple of options available, right? Transit agencies can choose to work, with the codes, and I should say not transit agencies necessarily, but project owners. Project owners can choose to work with the code on a voluntary basis and then reference them directly in the procurement contracts that they
Gotcha.
might be setting. And so that's kind of one available mechanism. And then other options will be for, provincial or government bodies to consider, referencing these in their regulations if they find that they meet their needs. We will be regularly updating the transit code, so it'll become a living document once it is published. So it'll go on a 4 or 5-year code cycle, which will mean that the technical committee will be evaluating the content, determining whether anything else needs to go in to reflect emerging needs or emerging technologies. And it'll be, again, a living document that will continue to evolve and improve over time.
Gotcha. Thanks again for joining me, first of all. I
Yeah.
appreciate the conversation.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, current next steps and anything you'd like to add that maybe I should have asked?
Absolutely. So again, we're very excited about this project. I think it's something that Canada as a whole desperately needs to help us make sure that future projects benefit from the best available knowledge that exists within the transit industry, and that projects are completed in a more efficient manner moving forward, so that tax dollars can be stretched a little further to get us more transit, which everybody wants, right? So
Right.
we recognize the substantial investment that's currently being made by both federal and provincial governments to the tune of $250 billion here in Canada. So it's absolutely impressive, and we're here to support these major projects in the best way that we can, which is through standards development. I do want to emphasize that, although we're at the starting point with this particular code, there are many standards that are currently under development at CSA that are going to be valuable to future transit and passenger rail projects. So One of those is a new standard development project that we have initiated on transit tunnels. So that's currently a major initiative that is under development, and that again will be absolutely critical and valuable for future transit projects that involve tunneling. We're also developing standards around safety management for railways, and these are inspired by the EU Common Safety Methods and are already being applied in Canada. So it's a series of 6 standards. 2 of them are already published. We're working on the third one. So this is a large body of work that's under development here at CSA, and that was inspired by Metrolinx actually flagging the need for these standards to our organization. And then last but not least, we're working on railway electrification standards, which is, again, a really important topic and highly relevant with modern transit and passenger rail projects here in Canada. So all of these items are under development. The code will make reference to all of these new standards that are being developed for the Canadian landscape. And of course, we will continue to build on those with new standards development projects.
Great. Ana-Maria, I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us, and hopefully we'll be able to keep up with you and kind of update this project as it goes forward.
Thank you so much for having me today, Alex. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, looking forward to to how this project pans out for us. And we're very excited to be again supporting the transit and passenger rail space here in Canada.
Great. Thanks again.